To say sprinting is a competitive industry would be an understatement. Every day there are literally thousands of people competing to be the next Bolt. It takes something really special to be the fastest man alive. Why is Usain Bolt so fast? At the highest level, there is very little separating elite athletes, except for Bolt's legs, which separate a hell of a lot more than his competitors. To explain that without a lame joke, in reality there are many factors, but I'm going to focus on something that is very rarely talked about: Bolt's hip extension. It's noticeably better than his competitors, and if we analyze this, we can understand why this is giving him such an advantage. This is actually something that's super easy to see and understand if you know what to look for. So I'm going to highlight the background info that you need to grasp what's going on here so you can understand this concept really well. There's basically two things you need to understand: a couple of bones and some muscles. So the bones we need to understand, firstly, is your leg. It's just two sticks, basically. There's not much to it. It's got a ball on the top and it connects to the hips. The hips can be kind of intimidating to think about, but really they're actually super simple. We can think of them just like a square, flat, even box. In particular, I want you to pay attention to the flat line that we're going to draw along the top of this box. All that happens is the legs slot up into this and connect to them. That's all they do. And last, we have the spine. And all the spine does is connect onto the hips. And the spine influences the position of the hips a lot because it's connected by bone. It's really only the bottom bit that does that, not so much the top spine, but those are all the bones we need to know. Then you just need to know about a couple of muscles. The ones on the front attach from the front of the leg to the front of the hip, and from the front of the leg to the front of the spine. Those are your hip flexor muscles. And all they do is lift the leg up in front of you. Or if the leg is still, pull the torso down. Then you've got your muscle on the back of the leg that goes from the back of your leg to the back of your hips. And this is called your glute max. And all it does is lift the leg behind you. There are other muscles, but we're not going to focus on them. We're just focusing on these things alone. Okay, let's put this whole thing together. Our legs are just two sticks. We put those in. Then we have our hips. These are a square box. And we're going to remove the bottom half of the square and just leave the line on the top. And this is going to tell us what people's hips are doing, whether they're flat or whether they're tilting forward or whether they're tilting back, basically how they're orientated in space. And then the final thing we're going to add into this is a line. And this line is just going to go at a right angle to these hips. So if the hips are flat, it's going to go in a straight line down through the middle of them. And what this is going to give us the opportunity to do is to measure how much hip extension we're getting. If the leg is in front of that line, this line is the neutral point. If the leg is in front of that line, it means the leg is in hip flexion. And if the leg is behind that line, it means the leg is in hip extension. And that is determined by those muscles we just learned. So if the muscles at the front are pulling it forward, it's the hip flexors and it's going into hip flexion. And if the muscle at the back are working, it's pulling the leg backwards and that's hip extension. Now, if we look at this race and these elite athletes, who do we think is going to have the best hip extension? Spoiler alert, it's Usain Bolt. Of course it's Bolt. Now, there's lots of different ways we can look at this. We can look at the end point of his step. And as we pause this frame, we can see the angle that he reaches with his leg consistently is a great hip extension angle. And that is the angle between that vertical line we drew and his back leg coming back. And that's how much functional hip extension he's getting in his step. If we compare that to his competitors at various points in the race, they don't get as much as him. If we look at this guy here, ignore the fact that those lines are further apart, but rather look at the angle of the lines from the center point to his back leg. At best, this angle is 2 or 3 degrees. This is much smaller than Bolt's, and thus he's getting a much smaller range of hip extension. This guy here is actually doing a better job, and no surprise ends up coming second in this race. However, his leg is still not coming as far back as Bolt's. That hip extension angle is still consistently smaller. This leg isn't moving back as far as it needs to. Now, it's worth mentioning for these elite athletes that their hips and their spine sit at these right angles pretty neatly. This doesn't happen when we start to look at regular people. They do things pretty differently, but for these athletes, it's fair to compare because they're actually very stable through their torso. They're not moving around here at all, and their hips are pretty stable as well. The only thing that's really varying is how much functional hip extension they're getting. Now, Theo, you might be asking, what about glute size and power? Doesn't that determine how much that leg can come back? And to some extent, the answer is yes, but that is not the whole picture. This example in particular really illustrates this. Bolt's competitor in this race is thick with a capital T. He's got all that power, but he can't utilize it. His functional range of motion is too small. He's barely getting to neutral. This angle is close to 0. He's barely making it past that midline. Look at this compared to Bolt's. They're not even on the same playing field. There's no wonder that Bolt is just speeding past him in this race. Glute size and power determines how fast and powerful that pushing movement with the leg is, whereas hip extension is the range of motion that it travels through. This range of motion is actually much more important, as the most useful part of the step for generating power is when the leg is directly behind you. Hip extension determines two things: how ideal the angle is for force output and how long your foot can apply force into the ground for. If you put your leg in front of you, it doesn't make you go any faster. The only time you can generate speed, or really good amounts of speed, is when that leg is pushing behind you. So Bolt can do that for longer, thus he gets faster. Now there are a few quick bonus things I should mention that I won't cover in too much detail in this video, but it's really important also that as the leg comes back behind you, it straightens. This doesn't really work if your leg is bent the whole time, because then your foot isn't on the ground, so keeping the leg straight as it comes back is super important too. As well as that, Bolt's torso position is very neutral, he's very upright, and this goes with his neutral hip position. This is also super important, won't cover it too much. Anyway, hip extension is one of the biggest single influencing factors for top speed. Of course, things like training and genetics matter, but hip extension is super important, mostly because we can change it, unlike genetics, which isn't very malleable. And things like jumping power are super influenced by this as well. People kind of have a reductionist approach where they think big glutes equals strong jump. It does help, but that functional range is super important. So how much your leg can open and extend behind you while you're trying to jump will hugely influence the jumping power that you have. And this applies to basically every single sport. Like if you're on your legs, I think maybe wheelchair basketball is an exception, but if you're on your legs, this is super relevant for top speed, for efficiency of movement, for everything. And I really would like it if you guys started to look for this yourselves. These concepts aren't too difficult. You can see this. This isn't some abstract concept. This is something that is definitively viewable, that you can look for. And the more you look for it, the more you'll start to see it. And you might be asking yourself, oh, cool, Theo, this is super interesting, but does this apply to me? And the answer is, hells yes, it is. You can't change your genetics, but you can change your functional usage of the body you've got. This can make such a big difference to your performance, whatever the sport you're doing. And it's something that is absolutely learnable. And that's what I'm going to do next week. Break down how you learn the skill and how you can learn to run like Bolt.